I'm excited to be continuing our six-part series in partnership with the Pay Equity Office of Ontario, right here on What She Said. Last month, we looked at the history and purpose of Ontario's Pay Equity Office, and there's much more to come, including a look at pay equity versus equal pay for equal work, the gender pension gap, and the intricacies of employment law for women. Today, though, we're honing in on the gender wage gap, a topic that affects countless individuals across the province and beyond. Joining me once again is Commissioner Kadie Philp, here to shed light on this pressing issue. Welcome back to What She Said, Kadie.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
So let's dive straight into the heart of the matter. Can you paint us a picture of the current landscape of the gender wage gap in Canada and Ontario, where we stand, and how has the situation evolved over recent years?
Sure. And I'm going to start, Candace, with some good news for your listeners and your audience. So the good news is the hourly wage gap has actually narrowed from 6 to 13 percentage points across all provinces since 1998. So that's great news. But to give you an example, in Ontario alone, it's narrowed 6 percentage points since 1998. To 13%, which is the current gender wage gap in Ontario when we look at average hourly wages. And we'll talk later about the different metrics that you can use and why those different metrics give us different numbers. But I think your listeners will find it interesting that, across the province, I'm going to use average hourly wage right now, but Ontario comes in about sixth place at 13%. And Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador are also at 13%. Prince Edward Island is the lowest in the country at 4%. New Brunswick, 8%, Nova Scotia, 8%, Quebec, 10%, Manitoba, 11%. And actually, the gender wage gap is the highest in Alberta and British Columbia at 17%. Maybe not a coincidence that neither of them have any sort of legislation that addresses pay equity. But the average hourly gender wage gap across Canada is 13%. So Ontario is on par with the Canadian average. So is Saskatchewan and Newfoundland and Labrador. We know, without getting into the details here, but we know that the gender wage gap is larger for racialized women and women who are newcomers, women with disabilities, Indigenous women. And we need better data to really understand the breadth and depth of the problem. We just started collecting more intersectional data at Stats Canada and through other organizations. But we know in some part that it's linked to part of what I talked about our last conversation, to historical biases and stereotype of the types of bodies that we value at work.
And I'm happy to hear, of course, obviously, that the gender wage gap is closing. What's driving this change? Are there specific initiatives or societal shifts that are contributing to narrowing the gap?
It's a good question, because when we look at why or understand why it's closing, we can think about, okay, what can we do to continue those trends, to continue to close the gender wage gap? We know certain, really measurable things, like women have an increased educational attainment. So one of the reasons for paying women in the labor market, a long time ago, is that they had less education. They also had less access to education, but we'll just leave that aside. That's a different conversation. But women's increased attainment of education has really been a key factor to closing the gender wage gap, because they're coming out with higher credentials, which need to be rewarded and compensated for fairly in the labor market. Also, the distribution of men and women across different occupations are changing. So we talked a little bit about before, and listeners, if they missed it, can listen to the episode. We talked about the clustering of women and men into certain types of jobs. And it was very binary at that time, where it was men's work and women's work. And that sort of persistent clustering is starting to dismantle a bit. So we have women moving into higher paying sectors, and this kind of breaking down of the very strict, rigid, gender-based job classification system, which is in fact a really, really great thing. And so these are some of the things that are starting to close the gap. We can get into, later on, why it's persisting and what some of those reasons are. But we're seeing, these trends in women getting education, getting compensated for it, and moving into and dismantling this clustering practice.
And you mentioned sort of in the beginning that, measuring the gender wage gap, it seems pretty complex from the outside looking in. So can you help demystify this a bit? How exactly is that gender wage gap calculated, and what factors are considered in this equation?
So it is really complicated. And thank you for asking that question, because I hear numbers thrown around all the time. I'm like, that's not a wage gap, but okay. So it's typically measured in 4 different metrics. And I'm not going to, bring your listeners through a statistics lesson here, but the 4 measures you'll see are average hourly wages, median hourly wages, average annual earnings, and median annual earnings. And so, just to say, regardless of whatever of the 4 metrics you're using, the wage gap persists no matter how it's measured. But the average hourly, and it's what we often use, this measure is, I would say, less affected by gender differences in work. So we know that women tend to work less hours than men for a whole host of reasons, which could be another episode. But this is a participation gap, essentially, right? Higher expectations for unpaid care work, or work or family responsibilities, domestic work. This causes women to work less. And so this is an earnings gap. So this is what the average annual earnings would cover. So the average hourly is the hourly wage men and women get. It doesn't account for this sort of difference in the actual hours worked. Average annual gives us a bigger picture of sort of the economic well-being of women in the labor market, because it really reflects the full scope of the financial implications of the sort of gendered expectations of women in the labor market and their participation in the labor market, and what that is reflected in earnings. So obviously, if women are working less hours because of all of these other sort of social, cultural, religious expectations, they're going to have a lot less average annual earnings. And you see that reflected. Like, for instance, in Ontario, the gender wage gap, as I said, by the hourly average is 13%. But when you look at average annual earnings, it's up to 25%, because that accounts for the less hours worked. And that's different than the gender wage gap. That's a reflection of the broader labor market dynamics and gendered dynamics of the labor market. But it's important because it shows the economic impact this has on women, which is certainly an important metric to be looking at, the financial well-being of women in the labor market.
So, this is where we reach the part of the interview that gets me really fired up, because this still persists. You've been around since 1987.
Yeah.
As we discussed in the last episode, we've been fighting this for a while, long before even the Pay Equity Commission even came into being. We've been fighting for this equality, equity. So from your perspective, what are the root causes that continue to fuel this disparity? And more importantly, what steps can we take to address these underlying issues?
Well, part of it, and I'll push your listeners back to the episode we talked about, because I don't have time to go into the history of the labor market here, but
yeah,
we're still dealing with legacy, right? We had laws that prescribed what type of work women and men could do, and limited women's ability to participate in labor market, and defined certain roles for them in a paid labor market. So the legacy of that, if you have, legislation or social, cultural, religious practices that have persisted for, a couple hundred years or thousands, but I mean, when we're talking about paid labor market, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution. So a couple of hundred years, it takes time to dismantle those biases. So as I mentioned in our last episode, those laws, most of them in at least North America, have been, dismissed, but there's still that legacy that's in place. So, a couple of broader things, though, and things where we can start to take action more immediately to make the difference is, it persists because women need to or choose to leave and re-enter the workforce in order to meet family caregiving responsibilities. So this is obviously, in many ways a woman's choice, and we should applaud and support that as well. But we should also consider if women don't want to do that, or if they need supports to do that, right? Like, you've talked a lot about being a single mother and the responsibilities and the challenges that creates. And if there's no social structures around it, or if we don't value women's participation, then we don't build structures to support that. So we have to think of some of these assumptions, especially the assumption of choice for women, because it's not always choice if it's a cultural expectation, or religious expectation, or moral expectation, or necessity, right? Because of the financial circumstances of the women. We do still see, occupational segregation. So I mentioned it's dissipating, but it's there. And so we need to continue to push for that and get women and men to move into, different job spheres that would start to level the paying field, which is the name of our podcast from our office. So we can see that gender wage gap closing. We know talk about why it persists. We know that things like education, job tenure, full-time versus part-time work, we've talked a little bit about that, public versus private sector, unionization rates, the size of a firm, all of this kind of, explains part of the gap, but it only explains about 30% of the gap. So 70% remains unexplained. And we've talked a lot about, this unexplained part in a professional circles. And it essentially comes down to, discrimination and bias. So breaking down those stereotypes and these ideas of what women can and should do in the labor market. So I think that's where, we're spending a lot of time raising awareness about this, because this is where the shift has to happen to make the next major gains.
Yeah. And, education segments like this and what you do with the podcast and, blogs and articles that we're sharing, these are really important too, because education means empowerment, and it means you don't have to accept the status quo out there, because you know better. And so you can educate your employer and your colleagues and your friends. So I'm so grateful that we're doing this, and that, because I think a lot of people just assume that, things are just going to keep going the way they're going.
Right.
But you have to
They don't have
participate.
to. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You have to participate to change things. So this is great. Kadie, as usual, great information. What are you sharing over on the Pay Equity Office website that people can go search and look for?
Well, if they want to know more about the gender wage gap in general, we have a whole really great information page there on explaining and deconstructing what the gender wage gap is, and all the factors that we talked about, but in way more detail. So that's a great resource for people wanting to know more. And then, of course, they can listen to Level the Paying Field. You can find that wherever you listen to podcasts if they want to hear detailed conversations with other experts, with people from around the world, also having conversations about the gender wage gap, and people from across Canada as well who are doing this work. As you said, you've got to participate and take action. And so if you want to do that, listen to the podcast and you can hear other action that's being taken, and maybe sign up for something to get involved in.
All right. Incredible. Kadie, as usual, thank you so much for joining me. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.